Okay, moving swiftly on. The final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 7934 in the name of Alison Johnstone on strict liability. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I now call on Alison Johnstone to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I feel privileged to be able to raise this issue in this chamber and to be able to contribute to the debate on stricter liability for our roads. Thank you to the members who signed my motion to enable this debate to take place and to those who are in the chamber this evening. Road safety is an important issue because we all understand the benefits, indeed the necessity, of more people, young and old, walking and cycling wherever possible. These aren't niche activities, they're for all, and those who understand the positive impacts that active travel can have on the health of our population and our economy don't want Scotland to miss out. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, hundreds of people, prompted by Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, will gather outside the Scottish Government offices at St Andrew's House to call on Finance Secretary John Swinney to double investment in walking and cycling from its current 1% of the transport budget. And this is because there are so many benefits to increasing the number of folk walking and cycling, yet current levels of investment keep us from realising these. I'll be there at St Andrew's House tomorrow because I believe that investment in these activities has so many environmental, social and economic impacts, positive impacts, and we have the cost-benefit analysis to support this. I also believe the concept of stricter liability in Scottish civil law, which we are debating today, has the potential to improve the safety of pedestrians and cyclists and to get more people active. I'm not alone. Spokes, CTC Scotland, Sustrans Scotland, Pedal on Parliament, Scott and Jenny Hastings, the Andrew Cyclist Charitable Trust and Scottish Cycling, among many others, would like to see the law of liability on the road changed to mirror European legislation, placing the onus of responsibility on the least vulnerable. Presiding Officer, we know people don't cycle because they don't feel safe. 88% of respondents to the Cycle Action Plan for Scotland said they'd like to cycle more often, but many are deterred by traffic speed, proximity and volume. These are real fears. Already 12 cyclists have died on our roads this year, despite a background of declining casualty figures for other modes of transport. Last week, following the release of Transport Scotland figures, a national newspaper headline proclaimed that Scotland is the deadliest place to go for a walk. There is a real need to make our roads safer for vulnerable groups and make sure they feel safe too, with a culture of mutual respect. Stricter liability is not a magic remedy, but it is, I believe, an important part of the jigsaw. Infrastructure, cycle training and driver awareness raising are vitally important. But while sharing road space with much larger vehicles is the norm for many pedestrians and cyclists, this is an inexpensive change we can make now to help make the transition to a cycle and walk-friendly nation. It's a tool to shift behaviour change. Cycle Law Scotland is mentioned in my motion, and I thank them for the briefing they have provided for today. What they and the 5,000 plus people who have signed their petition propose for most situations is presumed liability in road accidents. This concept simply shifts the onus of proof from the vulnerable to the powerful. So, if a cyclist is injured in a collision with a motor vehicle, the motorist will be liable for the cyclist's injuries unless the motorist can prove that the injuries were caused or contributed to by fault on the part of the cyclist. Yes.
I thank the member very much for taking an intervention, and I've listened carefully and looked at this issue. When you mention, obviously taking liability, and you also mentioned before about education, I would like to draw your attention to people who have spoken to me in my constituency and also had a petition in regarding cyclists who go on pavements and are a danger to pedestrians, and also cyclists who are not educated on the road. So I would like to see more emphasis put on that issue as well.
I accept the member's intervention. The highway code must be adhered to by all users. Cyclists will not be immune from ensuring that their behaviour is as good as it should be. As I was saying, this will not give the cyclists immunity. Cyclists will still have their obligation to ride in a safe and proper manner and in accordance with the rules of the Highway Code. And if they don't follow the rules, it could easily be argued that they'd contributed to their own injuries and therefore shared liability, or indeed were wholly liable. Stricter liability also doesn't affect the important concept of innocent until proven guilty, which is central to our criminal law, but not civil law. Stricter liability, in fact, already exists in Scotland in consumer product regulations, dangerous animal laws and workplace regulations. What Cycle Law Scotland's proposals will do is simplify and speed up the claims made when accidents happen and shift the burden of proof to the more powerful vehicle. As a city councillor in Edinburgh, I was contacted by an elderly man who was involved in a collision with a cyclist on Bruntsfield Links. If stricter liability existed in civil law in Scotland, the cyclist would be liable for the injuries caused, where currently we have a situation where both parties seek to prove the other as at fault. And what happens elsewhere in the world? Well, the situation here in Scotland is unusual. In Europe, only Malta, Ireland, Romania, Cyprus and the UK have no form of strict or presumed liability in road accidents involving vulnerable road users. Every other country does, which suggests that this change is hardly a drastic or a radical move.
Maureen Watt.
I thank the member for giving way, and although not called to speak in this debate, I have done some background work on it. Can the member tell us in which countries which have strict liability have lower better safety records with cyclists? Because it seems to me that there isn't a correlation between having this law and a more safe highways for cyclists.
Thank you.
Alison Johnstone.
It's fair to say that the government has produced some statistics, but the desk-based research from Transport Scotland was fairly limited in its scope. It didn't involve speaking to anyone in a nation that has strict liability. It hasn't sought a comprehensive overview of the system's impact for pedestrians and cyclists, and perhaps that's something the Minister could address when he's closing. I think the important thing to say is that we're not going to change the world overnight with this policy alone. It's part of a mix of measures. It's part of the safer roads culture jigsaw we need to bring about a walking and cycling nation, where vulnerable road users and pedestrians are protected and where people feel safer on the roads. Changes to civil law to improve road safety must not be off the table at this early stage in the debate. I'm interested to hear the Minister's response to the contributions today, and I hope to urge the Government to reconsider their position of opposition to this idea to one of openness, so that the idea can continue to be debated. The step change in road safety will come from redesigning our roads and junctions so that they prioritise pedestrians and cyclists, from proper on-road cycle training and from a culture of mutual respect and tolerance on this shared space. Stricter liability is a contribution to a better culture on our roads, where vulnerable users are better protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Rob Gibson, to be followed by Graham Pearson. 4 minutes, please. Today.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate Alison Johnstone in bringing this important debate to the Chamber at this time. And I, first of all, preface my remarks of my own research with the issues related to Cycling Action Plan for Scotland, in which comparisons across countries were looked at. Now, it may be described as a desktop survey, but it was hindered by differing circumstances, such as different legal approaches to liability, as well as differing laws on road speeds and different cycling cultures, different geographies and many other factors that we were told about. So the issue doesn't become perhaps as clear-cut as it might be. And the correlation between the issues of accidents and liability are quite difficult to prove in any of the figures that I've actually seen. I'm pleased that in the debate that at the end of the motion, the proposer has suggested that, in fact, stricter liability rules could have a positive benefit for the safety of more vulnerable road users. If stricter were being discussed in terms of the Scots term, then, I'll be interested to see what the Minister has to say. But stricter liability is something which does need to be investigated because it's something we don't know fully enough about yet. However, it's also quoted in the motion as being part of a package of measures. Now, I would suggest that when we look at the other countries, and part of what I already said, Presiding Officer, was that there's been different rates of development, there are different laws affecting that. And in 2009, in December, when myself and other members of the TIC committee were present at the climate change conference in Copenhagen, Cathy Peaty, MSP, and myself met with the political head of the Danish Cyclists Federation and indeed the head of the transport of the Copenhagen Commune to discuss these matters. And it was interesting to hear what they had to say about the development of cycling, which was that the more people who cycle, the less accidents there are proportionately. We would agree. Cycle lanes encourage people to cycle. They are most effective when they are physically raised out of the way of other traffic, rather than simply painted as lines on the road. And that indeed electric bikes are used on hills, and it would be perhaps an encouragement to people to do the same here. However, in terms of traffic experiments, getting people aware of cycling, this was seen in Copenhagen as a very important approach. So you do use lines on the road to show people where they're supposed to go. And you do these on a temporary basis in order to stimulate the debate about the ways in which people might see cycling in a different light. And also in terms of safety, the number of deaths and serious injuries to cyclists has fallen significantly in recent years. However, the issue about where cyclists cross the line of traffic, in Denmark's case, a right-hand turn, in our case, a left-hand turn, is something which is very difficult even for them to actually deal with, and therefore making it possible for cyclists and other road users to be separated is something which actually requires even more investment than has been applied in Copenhagen. But also it's emphasised that in traffic planning, where possible, removing or mitigating conflicts between cyclists and road users is a very good idea. So there's a culture of innovation in relation to cycling in Copenhagen, and I'd like to see that here. Initiatives include, for example, competitions to encourage bicycle sharing, adjusting traffic light cycles to allow cyclists to a clear run on busy streets, and redesigning the stations for the local trains so that there are sunken bicycle parks and so on. Many of these measures are issues which would be part of the measures we need to look at in terms of this debate, and I hope that Presiding Officer will hear from the Minister on some of these points, which seem to me to strengthen the case for cycling in a way that stricter liability is only partially possibly going to do so.
Many thanks. Now Colin Graham Pearson, to be followed by Margaret Mitchell. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, could I commend Alison Johnstone for achieving this debate this evening, examining the safety of pedestrians and cyclists on Scotland's roads. The Government quite properly encourages a healthy lifestyle and is keen that we should encourage cycling and walking in our public byways. And that's entirely right, and it reflects previous administrations in the past. But statistics over these last 10 years make for dire reading, as the Minister will know himself. In the statistics that I've obtained, it reflects that 88 cyclists were killed in the 10 years to 2012. And during the same period, 1,408 cyclists were seriously injured. The numbers of slight injuries were many times multiplied by these numbers. So we are dealing with a serious issue in terms of public safety, and it's acknowledged that the Government currently spends around £60 million a year examining active travel and infrastructure, and I know that the Minister announced recently an additional £20 million to be spent over the next 2 years. One can hope that that spend will focus on primarily road safety issues and the protection of cyclists for the purpose of our current debate, but also pedestrians. The issue about increasing the funding in that regard is obviously a matter for the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in terms of the current budgetary arrangements. And it will be interesting to hear from the Minister what he might achieve in that regard. Although it's not been directly alluded to, the issue of strict liability, I've discovered, seems to polarise public opinion. And there are those who are indeed very supportive of the concept, but equally numbers who are vehemently against the notion that strict liability should be introduced in the Scottish context. I think I understand both sets of opinions in this regard, and like the comments that Maureen Watt made earlier, I did search the material provided to find if there was a link between the introduction of new legislation and a fall in the numbers of accidents and injuries, and unfortunately it wasn't entirely obvious to me in that regard. In that circumstance, I would be interested to hear from the Minister whether or not he would undertake to achieve some better understanding of the implications for road safety in terms of strict liability and stricter liability, in order that a more informed approach could be taken to these matters and we could address whether or not improvements can indeed be achieved in this regard. In terms of the wider issue about the motion, I do think that the motion provides a good linchpin for us to take forward our discussions in relation to this whole issue of safety. It would be really useful, I believe, for the Minister to commit the Scottish Government to take forward matters by bringing together key stakeholders and those experts that he can access, with the intentions of establishing some form of consensus for future recommendations, in order that we can achieve a degree of consensus in this chamber about whether or not legislation is necessary, is desirable, is effective, and would create for us a means of providing safety for those people who would seek to either walk on our public highways or use cycles. I think, importantly, there is no doubt that the Minister himself and his government go some way to encourage the development of cycling across Scotland. And I know that they are very enthusiastic in this regard. I do think that there is a real responsibility to take on board the issues that have been raised during this motion, with a view to pulling together a positive way of taking forward those issues and coming up with a better way for the future. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many
thanks. And due to the number of members who wish to speak in the debate, I am minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. I now invite Alison Johnstone to move such a motion.
I so move.
Many thanks. So the question is, are members agreed that we will extend this debate tonight? We are. Many thanks. So I now call on Margaret Mitchell to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking Alison Johnstone for bringing this debate to the Chamber this evening? As stated in the motion, there are an unacceptable number of injuries and fatalities to pedestrians and cyclists on our roads. In 2012, according to the statistics from Transport Scotland, 898 cyclists were injured in Scotland, and this represents a 9% increase on 2011. There were 9 fatalities last year. Furthermore, whilst the same statistics revealed a welcome 5% decrease in the number of pedestrian casualties in 2012, there were nonetheless a shocking 54 pedestrians killed and 1,950 injured. Given these worrying injuries and worse still fatalities, then clearly more must be done to improve road safety, particularly for the most vulnerable users. On this, there is no division of opinion in the Chamber this evening. The thorny question, however, is precisely what should be done. Here, strict liability has been described as a road safety measure. However, I do not accept that the introduction of strict liability will necessarily make roads safer or lead to fewer accidents on our roads. In fact, it could encourage an irresponsible cyclist who, despite the hierarchy of road users, is perfectly capable of causing a multiple pile-up to be even more irresponsible, secure in the knowledge that the presumption of fault would lie with the driver. Yes, certainly.
Alison Johnstone.
I'd just like to explain to the member that this is presumed liability, but the cyclist is not immune from behaving responsibly and properly on the road. And, as the case went forward and was discussed, if the cyclist was found to be at fault, they would be found to be at fault.
I understand, but we're talking about an irresponsible cyclist here who has little regard for road users, and I rather fear this would send out the wrong message. Strict liability places the onus on drivers to prove they are not responsible or at fault, rather than assuming that both parties are innocent of fault until proven otherwise. This imposes an unacceptable and unjustifiable pressure on drivers who may not, if they were not at fault for the incident, they may not be able to prove that they were not responsible. There are therefore unintended and adverse consequences associated with the introduction of strict liability. Nor is it likely that making drivers presumed liable if they are involved in an accident with cyclists will encourage the mutual respect which should be present between road users. It may even potentially make what is, in some cases, an antagonistic relationship between cyclists and drivers worse. In addition to this, in terms of the irresponsible drivers on our road, the introduction of strict liability will not change their behaviour or encourage safer driving amongst those who already have no thought for other road users and cause accidents. Instead, all road users should be held equally responsible for road safety and consequently equally potentially liable for an accident. This view is therefore formed as a basic overriding principle which should not be deviated from merely to bring Scotland and the UK into line with the rest of Europe, and regardless of the assertions that the introduction of strict liability in countries like Denmark or Holland have resulted in a decrease in accidents. To make roads safer, especially for cyclists and pedestrians who are more vulnerable, all road users must be encouraged to act responsibly. So rather than debating the introduction of strict liability, we should instead concentrate on other measures to achieve this objective, such as reducing speed limits to 20 miles per hour in residential areas, increasing enforcement for both cyclists and drivers who break the law, delivering better road design with dedicated cycle lanes, and undertaking more education and awareness training for cyclists and drivers so they have a better understanding and appreciation of each other's needs on the road. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, there are responsible and considerate drivers and cyclists on a road. It is those irresponsible road users who need to be tackled in an effort to change their unacceptable and dangerous behaviour, rather than focusing on the introduction of strict liability with the adverse consequences associated with it.
Many thanks. Now call on Kevin Stewart to be followed by Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all apologise to members as I have to leave early as I've got other parliamentary business to attend at 5:30. Colleagues can be assured that I will look at all contributions in the official report. Can I congratulate Alison Johnstone in bringing this debate to Parliament today? And as our motion states, I too would like to see further debate on this issue. Last night, Presiding Officer, I arrived in Edinburgh at around 9 o'clock. And as we all know, it's getting a little bit dark at that time. It's the time of year. I have to say that tiredness got the better of me, and I took a taxi from Waverley Station to the Cannon Mills area. And on that short journey, I spotted 2 cyclists in the road without lights, and 3 pedestrians crossed in front of the cab in what I thought was rather a dangerous manner. I'm not a driver, I'm often a passenger, and this kind of behaviour, I have to say, seems to be becoming the norm. The other side of the coin is, of course, that I often see drivers acting in a dangerous manner to pedestrians and cyclists. And I truly believe that common courtesy and common sense needs to be put into practice by all who use our highways and pavements. Whether you're a pedestrian, a cyclist or a driver, you should always be aware of others and treat them with respect. Now, this debate today is round about civil law, and yet every single constituent who has contacted me today about this debate has brought up some criminal matters, and in particular the tragic death of Audrey Fife and the situation round about that court case, where many of my constituents believe that the perpetrator got off far too lightly and the sentence was far too lenient. And I share those views with my constituents because at the end of the day, if somebody had killed two folk with a shotgun, it would be unlikely that they would ever get a shotgun licence again. So why would they get a driving licence again? And I think this is the difficulty around about what we're discussing here, because most of the difficulties lie round about criminal law. And unfortunately, here in this place, we do not control all aspects of road traffic legislation. I wish certainly I'll give way to Mr.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member. I hope that he recognises that part of the objective of raising this issue is to contribute to a positive culture change on our roads and the relationship between drivers, cyclists and pedestrians. It doesn't need to impact on sentencing. If we can address that culture change, we may see fewer such cases in future.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr. Harvey for his contribution. And I hope that there can be a positive change and that we can see that common sense and courtesy from all, as I talked about previously. But I do think that a lot of the heat round about the debate that we're having today is not about the civil law, but about the criminal aspects of that. And certainly from the mail that I have had from constituents, and there have been quite a few, it is mainly that the Fife case has featured very, very highly indeed. And I don't think, Presiding Officer, that we can actually divorce the civil aspects from the criminal aspects of this. And that is why I say that we should have all of the powers in terms of road traffic legislation in this Parliament. Presiding Officer, I would like once again to thank Alison Johnstone for bringing this matter to Parliament. And in my opinion, this is the start of the debate, not only in the civil aspects, but also in the criminal ones. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now calling Kezia Dugdale to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And like others, can I congratulate Alison Johnstone on securing this debate and start at the offset by saying or acknowledging that I don't have the cycling credentials that Alison or indeed my colleague Sarah Boyack does. Back in 2007, I was Sarah's election agent, and it used to infuriate me as her election agent that she insisted on cycling everywhere to each engagement, and she would insist on doing so without a helmet. And she would try and convince me that she was actually safer without wearing a helmet, and I was never convinced by that argument. My attitudes to cycling have changed over the years, and I'll come on to that in a second, but I think it's important to recognise Alison Johnstone and Sarah Boyack's long-standing interest in cycling as a policy and political issue. Margaret Mitchell and Rob Gibson have talked tonight about Copenhagen. I was in Copenhagen earlier this year, and as I was exploring the fantastic city, I found myself in the middle of a march, and I couldn't work out what the march was because all the signs were in Danish, so I followed it right round to the Christiansborg Palace, and I thought by the point I got to the palace that I had worked out that this was the Danish pedal parliament. So I stopped a few of the people on the march and said, "What is it that you're campaigning for?" And it turned out it was actually all the teachers in Denmark who were locked out. They were all striking from their work. It just happened that they all had bicycles, because that was how intrinsic to daily life in Denmark cycling was. And that taught me that what we really need in Scotland is a cultural shift, so that cycling is something that the majority of people do. And I think we're a long way off getting to that point. And frankly, Presiding Officer, I think it's people like me that need to be persuaded that cycling is a safe activity. After this year's pedal in Parliament, I purchased a bike, and I now cycle fairly regularly regularly, but I only cycle 2 places, one to Portobello Beach, which I can do from my house entirely off-road, thanks to the Restorig railway path and all the public investment that's gone into off-road cycling paths in Edinburgh. And I can also cycle to my gym, where I only have to cross one main road, and I can do that by pushing the bike over the street. There's no way I would cycle to work, because that would involve cycling up Easter Road in the morning at peak times. It's just too dangerous. And until I can be persuaded that it's safe, or we invest in the infrastructure in a way that it becomes safe and obvious to everyone, then I don't think we're going to meet that challenge. Can I pay tribute to all the cycling campaigners who regularly contact MSPs on a number of different issues relating to the cycling agenda? It is probably the single biggest issue that comes into my inbox, paralleled only by equal marriage in terms of the strength of feeling and regular contributions that I have on that issue. The people who write to me regularly write about active travel and have done for a number of years now, and many of those people who have written to me about active travel are now writing about strict liability. And I get the sense that some people within the cycling community aren't utterly convinced that strict liability is the answer, but what they see is a need to speak out about a sense of anger and frustration within the cycling community just now about the number of accidents, about the number of deaths, about the number of people who find themselves at risk trying to get to their work because our roads just aren't safe. And I think there is some legitimate criticism of the government's own plans around the Nice Way Code campaign, which I would like to hear Keith Brown comment on tonight, because there is a sense that some of the things that the Nice Way Code has been trying to encourage cyclists to do actually puts them in further danger. And unless we get a sense of community between cyclists and people that drive and all the other users of our highway system, then I don't think we're going to get to the critical point where we need to drive cultural change. In concluding, Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful to a couple of my constituents who are avid cyclists who have offered me free cycling lessons to try and improve my own cycling confidence. I may well take them up on that, but I think first and foremost we need to have a serious conversation about what safety on our roads means. So I welcome this debate and once again congratulate Alison Johnstone on bringing it to the Chamber.
Many thanks. Now call on Jim Eadie to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is an important debate and I congratulate Alison Johnstone for bringing it before the Chamber this evening. I was an early co-signatory to Ms Johnston's motion and I am pleased to add my own voice to those of colleagues of all parties who believe that now is the time for us to have this debate not just on cycling safety generally, but also on the role that stricter liability could play. This may be a matter concerning the civil law, but let me stress that this is not an abstract or arcane subject as it concerns the safety and indeed the lives of our fellow citizens, a number of whom, let us not forget, have sadly lost their lives in recent years. As such, I believe that there can be no more important subject to come before us. I acknowledge that this is an issue on which there is not currently a consensus, and I recognise that the law could only be changed following an extensive period of consultation, active engagement with all of the stakeholders affected, and a full and frank debate about what any proposed change would mean in practice for cyclists, pedestrians and road users. However, I believe that the basic proposition behind stricter liability is a fair and sound principle on which to proceed. And this is the legal norm in many European countries, such as Denmark, France and the Netherlands, all countries which have a record on cycling which we in Scotland would wish to emulate. Now, the Scottish Government maintains, it's a point that Maureen Mowat made in her brief contribution, that the data does not supply robust evidence of a direct link between strict liability legislation and killed or seriously injured statistics. However, the fact does remain that as part of a series of measures, such as 20-mile-per-hour zones in residential areas and more awareness training, points made by Margaret Mitchell in her contribution, that measures such as strict liability legislation have helped to initiate a step change in the culture towards cycling and cyclists in those countries that have adopted it. And part of the context for this debate is, of course, the Scottish Government's own ambitious target to ensure that 10% of all journeys are made by bicycle by 2020. That ambition is at the centre of the Government's own Cycling Action Plan for Scotland and is embedded in a range of government policies. I thought that Spokes, the Lothian Cycle campaign, put it rather well when they stated, "We believe that the single most essential measure for achieving this goal, that of the target of 10% of journeys by bicycle, is ensuring that road conditions are and feel safe and welcoming for making everyday trips to work, shops, school and leisure by bike. In this way, more cycle use should be encouraged, whilst at the same time reducing cycle casualty rates and ideally absolute casualty numbers. Now, I know that the Minister for Transport and Veterans is actively engaged in the safety agenda, and he said in March 2012, and I quote, "Scotland's roads are perfectly safe when everyone uses them responsibly and with respect for each other." That is precisely what this debate is seeking to highlight, and what I think stricter liability could make a contribution towards. Here, I believe we would do well to reflect on the experience of other European countries and to take on board the views of our own constituents. A number of my constituents have contacted me in recent days to make the following points. Stricter liability in civil law is the proper approach for a mature, socially conscious nation, as it addresses the unacceptable impact of the current system on our most vulnerable road users. Stricter liability will help promote the idea of Scotland being a cycle-friendly nation and show Scotland is leading the UK in cycle safety. The UK is one of only 5 countries in Europe which do not operate a system of strict liability, as Alison Johnstone said, and stricter liability helps to build a culture of greater respect between road users, as is seen on the continent. The tenet of protecting the vulnerable by way of stricter liability is not new to Scots law and can be found in consumer protection regulations and regulations concerning the control of dangerous animals. I believe, therefore, that it has an important contribution to make. I believe we have an opportunity here to extend and develop this long-standing principle and also better serve and protect our cyclists and pedestrians. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, across Europe, stricter liability is an accepted state of affairs, and while there is variation in how these regulations are applied, as Rob Gibson said, in individual countries, reflecting the individual cultures of those countries, it is seen to be a key element within a package of measures for encouraging safer road use for cyclists.
Many thanks. Now call on Claudia Beamish, to be followed by Christine Graham. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As Deputy Convener of the Cross-Party Group for Cycling and one who attempts to cycle in Edinburgh, not as much as I should, but I try anyway, I welcome this members' debate brought to the Chamber by Alison Johnstone. One of the valuable things that a members' debate does, in my view, is to get us asking questions in the lead-up to it. And also, of course, it focuses our minds as the briefings come in, forces prioritising an issue among many others in our busy schedules. And we have had an interest in this over time. Hopefully, we will also be learning, as I am today, in the debate itself, in the Chamber. And in the case of where a change of the law is mooted, as in this case, a members' debate perhaps forces us and our parties to work towards a position on an issue. And for all these reasons, I thank Alison. Before I came to the issue of presumed or strict liability itself, I want to make some remarks about active travel and cycling more broadly in the context of climate change targets, congestion and tourism. If we are to meet our climate change targets under the Act, we should be doing this in ways that benefit people on all incomes in all parts of Scotland. Modal shift is essential, as I'm sure we'll all agree in the Chamber today, to public transport and to trains and to active travel. Alison Johnstone's motion stresses that stricter liability rule could have positive benefits for the safety of more vulnerable road users as part of a package of measures. I recently met a constituent who cycles to work in Dumfries, and because of this, they are a one-car family. But really, roads have to be safer for cyclists as vulnerable users and indeed pedestrians if we are seriously going to take forward our active travel plans, which the Scottish Government has. Rural links are important as well. Across South Scotland, there are many places where people couldn't possibly cycle even between towns and villages, and this is an issue of importance, and we're working on that in the old Wishaw Road between 2 villages in my constituency. And further, as an ex-primary teacher, I'm keenly aware of the opportunities for pupils to cycle to school, but the issue of poor maintenance and the difficulties of sections of road around schools makes this pretty scary for pupils and something that parents and families don't want to commit to. Short journeys to shops and evening classes just down the road are things that some people wouldn't like to do on a bike either. Alison Johnstone, Jim Eady and myself in the cross-party group for cycling have taken forward the possibility of an award, which we have highlighted to the Minister, for different models of infrastructure and for segregated cycle lanes. And I think this is something that is important. But as one constituent highlighted to me in the lead up to this debate, segregated road cycle lanes are of course not possible on all roads. In the lead up to the debate, some have also said to me that some cyclists are casual about maintaining equipment and have suggested MOTs for cyclists. Others, all motorists with the exception of one, have said that they saw this or that pushy cyclist doing something casual or dangerous. But as I replied to them, there are many dangerous motorists too on our roads for sure. Lighting has been an issue, and leaving the last CPG for cycling, going back to my flat, I saw 2 cyclists without lights wearing dark clothing. Luckily, I did see them. Last summer, I was pleased to be asked by Cycling Law to give out cycling helmets at a primary school in Galashiels. And many a beaming child came up to receive their helmet, but I wondered how long they would be wearing those helmets. So there are many issues around cycling that need to be addressed. But none of these, in my view, negate the necessity for us to at least have a real assessment of the cycling issue. And last week in France, on holiday, I actually reflected that before that I'd thought, OK for Copenhagen, OK for Denmark or Holland, but there aren't the massive infrastructures for cycling in France, and yet there has been the strict-liability law there since 1986, and I do understand that since it's been introduced, fatalities and injuries have been decreased greatly. Cyclists do have a right to be there, which is an equal right to other road users, and they are vulnerable. And responsible cyclists, I believe, deserve the protection that possibly this strict liability would bring. And I hope that my party will be looking at this as a possibility, although at the moment there is a lot more assessment to do. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now calling Christine Graham, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I also congratulate the member on bringing forward this debate. And of course we say yes to too many fatalities and serious accidents, and yes to government initiatives, and yes to improving safety for cyclists on our roads and off our roads. But I say no to strict liability. Or is it strict liability? Let me be pernickety here. We're moving from strict liability to stricter liability to presumption of liability. Now, my understanding of strict liability means there is no defence, and it's used in product liability. For instance, you open your can of beans, there's a bit of a mouse inside. It doesn't say there's a bit of a mouse in the ingredients in your can of beans. That is strict liability. I think what the member is referring to is a presumption of liability. So if you're going to talk about the law, please be specific, because you're a muddle of using terms. May I also say to the colleague who's left that the sentencing of someone in a criminal case is based on the degree of culpability, not the consequences of what they do. You could run into a lamppost without due care and attention and kill nobody. You could run into a lamppost without due care and attention and kill somebody. The consequences are different, but the culpability remains the same. So we're thinking of trying to shift the onus from the facts and circumstances of every case as to whom or what is liable. Let's forget contributory negligence, which often occurs 50-50, 75-25. How does that work into it? But let's examine that principle if we extend it on the basis that in a collision between a cyclist and pedestrian, the principle should be extended to them, the presumption of liabilities in the cycle. Well, why not go further? Why not extend it to the mini and the minibus and the megabus, the panda car and pantechnicon? What principle is in operation here? There's a serious issue about if it is the greater power of the vehicle, certainly.
Alison Johnstone.
Just to be clear, we are not talking about different sizes of motorised vehicle. We're talking about protecting the most vulnerable road user. So to be absolutely clear, we're talking about a motorist who's in a collision with a cyclist, or a cyclist in collision with a motorist, not one car in a collision with a smaller vehicle.
I'm talking about a principle in law. The principle being here that you have the more powerful user of the road and the less powerful user of the road, and the presumption goes in favour of the less powerful. If that's the principle in operation, then we should look at applying it elsewhere. Scots law operates on principle. And by the way, Cycle Law's briefing referred to UK law. Now, much of the law in Scotland on derelict and negligence is Scots law, very, very different indeed. Now, let's take a multiple collision. Car shunts into the back of a car, it shunts into a cyclist, who shunts into another cyclist, who shunts into a pedestrian. Where is the presumption landing there? Where's the presumption of liability in that particular incident? You know, answers on a postcard. And then think of other unintended consequences of this. I'm just testing out the principle. All motorists carry compulsory insurance. If you introduce a presumption that the cyclist is not liable, and the presumption of liability falls on the user of the road, the motorist or the lorry driver, insurance premiums will rise. They will rise because all of these issues will be brought to insurance companies to first deal with it. Does that mean, therefore, it will follow that all cyclists will require to have third-party insurance so that we can have a knock-for-knock negotiation, as happens at the moment? All I'm raising with you are the issues in this. I have no difficulty whatsoever, having been knocked off my bike myself by a motorist. I have no difficulty in arguing about the lack of safety on roads, whether in urban areas or indeed in rural areas, where you can turn a corner and find 4 cyclists abreast, and you have to watch what you're doing. It's not the issue. The issue is about changing the law and the consequences of doing that to the law and to insurance.
Many thanks. Now call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by John Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I add my congratulations to my colleague Alison Johnstone for bringing the debate, and I'm very pleased to have had so many positive comments from around the chamber, notwithstanding the last speech, which it seemed to me was really expressing some frustration with the fact that we're not here with a single specific, fully developed proposal. Rather, we're opening a debate. And Alison Johnston's motion very clearly seeks further debate on this general area. Over the years, I've taken part in many debates on active travel, on walking and cycling. And at times, I felt just a tiny wee bit of a fraud. Because although I was a regular cyclist as a student, at the time in Manchester, cycling up Oxford Road and Wilmslow Road, at the time the busiest bus route in Europe, felt pretty dangerous. Even having had that experience in Glasgow, frankly, I was scared. I didn't want to cycle in Glasgow because I saw the state of the roads, with the potholes forcing cyclists in and out in busy streets. I saw the lamentable state of actual cycling provision, the appallingly inadequate cycle lanes that exist in Glasgow, some of which simply disappear in the middle of the street for no apparent reason. And indeed the behaviour of some motorists. But this summer, I took the plunge, I swapped my bus pass for a bike, and I haven't been happier since. For me, it's a hugely positive change that I've made in the way that I get about, and I count it as an unhappy day if I find myself still reliant on the services of First Glasgow. But the scenes that I've experienced are mixed. I have seen cyclists occasionally shooting a red light or cycling somewhere they shouldn't, including a pavement. To be honest, I understand that sometimes they're doing it because they don't feel safe otherwise. They're doing it to maximise their safety, not to try and pose a threat to others, not because they're being reckless to others' safety, but because of the state of the provision that's made available for them. But far more often than seeing a cyclist shoot a red light or cycle on a pavement or cycle at night without lights, I see motorists trying to get through the lights before or just after they've changed, trying to get through that last little opportunity to shoot through the lights, or cutting each other up, or cutting up a cyclist, or my personal favourite, failure to indicate. Failure to indicate on the part of motorists is so common in Glasgow that, frankly, you don't pay attention to the little blinking lights because it's not going to tell you what the vehicle is going to do. There's no correlation between what people use their indicators for and which direction the vehicle is going to move in. So there is a real need to address the responsibility that people feel, the responsibility that somebody feels when they're moving a ton or two of metal through the streets must be substantially higher than the responsibility that somebody feels when they're moving a couple of tens of kilos of metal through the streets. That's still significant. Moving a bicycle through the streets at a modest pace is still a significant thing to do, and it bears a significant responsibility. But the responsibility of somebody driving a couple of tons of metal through the streets at a much higher velocity must clearly be higher. And unlike Margaret Mitchell, I don't think that an approach to stricter liability of whatever formulation we end up debating would suddenly encourage cyclists to be much more irresponsible. The logic of that, because of the hierarchy nature of this, is that it would encourage lots of pedestrians to be running all over the roads causing accidents. What I think it would do is send a signal to people that cycling matters, that cyclists' safety matters, and that every road user is responsible for the impact that they're having on other people. And it would do one crucial thing, which I think is one of the most important things we can do to make cycling safer in Scotland, which is to get more cyclists out on the roads, normalising cycling and making it impossible for drivers, any drivers, to regard cyclists as an inconvenient and unnecessary intrusion into their private use of the road space.
Thanks very much. Now Colin John Lamont, to be followed by Graham Day.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start also by congratulating Alison Johnstone in securing this debate, and I was very pleased to have been able to support her motion. The debate this evening is absolutely not a debate about cyclists against motorists. For the record, I am both. This debate is about how the law should protect vulnerable road users and how we can best encourage cycling. Notwithstanding what we've heard already tonight, Conservatives are actually very pro-cycling. The UK Government is investing more in cycling than any previous British government. And in London, led by Conservative Mayor and cycle-fanatic Boris Johnson, he's very much leading the way in terms of cycling investment in the United Kingdom. By 2015, London will be spending more than 4 times what is spent per head on cycling than what is spent in Scotland. Now, we've already heard about the clear benefits of cycling to both cyclists and non-cyclists alike, which I will now not repeat. But we know that Scots want to cycle. In 2010, the Scottish Household Survey found that 35% of Scottish households have access to a bike, and the UK has one of the highest numbers of bike sales in Europe. And the numbers of people cycling to work and school are steadily rising. Yet we continue to have a woeful cycling rate compared to the rest of Europe. While the EU has an average of 7.4% of journeys made by bicycle, in the UK the figure is just over 1%. Now, the main barrier to increased cycle rates is a perception that this activity is dangerous. In fact, that perception is not accurate. The risks of cycling are roughly comparable to the risks faced by pedestrians, and the health benefits of cycling vastly outweigh the risks. But that perception certainly exists. Indeed, just last week, the Herald reported 56% of cyclists and non-cyclists reported that in a poll that they believed roads were unsafe for cycling, and one way to change that perception would undoubtedly be to introduce a law of strict liability. Now, there are some misconceptions about the issue of strict liability, which I think I'm just about to deal with. If the member would just give me one moment. It would not result in motorists becoming automatically liable, nor would it result in drivers being sent to jail. It would apply to civil cases only and would only establish a presumption which could be disproved in court. Now, that is why I prefer to use the term presumed liability. Importantly, it would apply equally to cyclists in an accident involving them and pedestrians as the more vulnerable road user. It already exists in the vast majority of other European countries without adverse and unintended consequences, and in countries with significantly better cycling usage and cycling safety than Scotland. Now, I believe that presumed liability should be considered for Scotland, as there is a good argument that it is fair, that it would make our roads safer, and that it would encourage cycling. It is fair because it acknowledges that there is a clear imbalance of road users, and that those driving a vehicle capable of causing harm to others should exercise caution. In virtually every collision between a car and a vulnerable road user, it will be the pedestrian or cyclist who will be injured, and it is therefore reasonable to place a greater burden of proof on the motorist. Now, I fail to see how anyone who accepts that cyclists have an equal right to be on our roads cannot support the introduction of legal safeguards which address this imbalance. Indeed, if you're a careful and observant motorist following the highway code, you have nothing to fear from the introduction of presumed liability. In conclusion, I do agree with the motion that presumed liability is not a panacea for cycling safety. It can only be one part of a raft of measures. The best way to improve safety is to increase cyclist numbers, and we can do that by proper infrastructure investment, including investment in junction safety, full segregation and additional cycle parking spaces, as well as schemes to encourage cycling to work, such as the Bike to Work scheme. More cyclists on our roads is good for cyclists and non-cyclists alike, and should be an aspiration of this Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Graham Day to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin, as others have, by congratulating Alison Johnstone for securing the debate? I do not agree with what cycle law is calling for, but like other contributors, I recognise there is a need to arrive at a safer coexistence between the various users of our roads through a package of measures, as the motion, to be fair, calls for. Encouraging more people to feel able to get on their bike is important both from a health and climate change perspective. But in seeking to achieve that, we have to examine in a balanced way the relationship between pedestrians, cyclists and vehicle users. And sadly, the petition to which the motion refers could hardly be described as balanced in its consideration of that relationship. I'm a car user, and one whose very mixed experiences of cyclist conduct on our roads leaves me believing that whilst we do need to consider how we arrive at a better, safer interaction between cyclists and vehicle users, what the petition calls for is wrong-headed. Claudia Beamish mentioned rural links. The constituency which I represent has a number of paths and lanes placed at the disposal of cyclists, which allows the proficient and not so proficient cyclists to either pursue what's an interest for them or indeed a means of commuting to and from work relatively safely. And there remains considerable scope, as my North Angus colleague Nigel Donn has highlighted in Parliament previously, to even better connect our counties, towns and villages to the benefit of cyclists. We do, though, of course, still have many instances where cyclists, vehicle users and indeed pedestrians have common usage of routes and where problems arise. But the most striking direct personal experience I've had of cyclists has been here in Edinburgh, generally in close proximity to this Parliament. And that experience reaffirms my belief that what is being called for by Cycle Law Scotland ought to be rejected. In a bustling major city such as Edinburgh, it must be incredibly intimidating at times for cyclists, as Kezia Dugdale highlighted. And the conduct and attitude of some drivers towards cyclists does leave a great deal to be desired. But let us be clear, those taking to the roads on bikes are also of very mixed ability and attitude. And to introduce a presumption of liability against motorists involved in incidents with cyclists is against that backdrop, and unless you have other measures taken, unjustifiable, I would contend. Of course, we need to better protect vulnerable road users, be they on foot or on a bike, but surely we must recognise that there are cases in which those vulnerable road users actually cause the very incidents which lead to their sustaining injuries. Yet Cycle Law Scotland want us to start from the premise that the driver is automatically deemed to be at fault, and it's up to them to prove they weren't. Indeed, in response to a query I raised with Cycle Law...
Alison Johnstone.
I do not believe that Cycle Law Scotland are talking about automatic liability. It's presumed liability. There is no automatic assumption that the driver will be at fault. I think what this does is it recognises that vulnerable road users are it's inherently dangerous to be sharing the road with motorised vehicles when you're a pedestrian and on foot, and that is why there's this different approach. Thank you.
I take the member's point, but the starting position is this, is the presumption that the driver is in the wrong. I raised this point with Cycle Law Scotland at this very point, and I was told they recognise that a cyclist may be negligent, and it was all be up to the motorist to argue that point. And in the case of young or elderly cyclists or pedestrians, we were told that the driver would need to establish a degree of recklessness on the part of the injured party. I'm not quite sure how that sits in terms of natural justice. But to accept that what the petition calls for is justified, one must believe that cyclists are rarely, if ever, at fault for traffic accidents, when the reality is that the behaviour of cyclists on our roads quite often leaves much to be desired, just as the behaviour of drivers does. In the course of the last few weeks, for example, just a short distance from here on London Road, I've witnessed two cyclists jumping off the road and onto the pavement in order to get round a queue of traffic before diving back onto the carriageway in front of moving vehicles. Presiding Officer, however, unlike cycle law, I do not deem it appropriate to tar one group of road users with the same brush. If we are to get more people cycling safely on our roads, we need to create a culture of respect between those who make use of those roads, a culture in which everyone is required to behave responsibly and held equally to account where they cause injury or damage through carelessness. I agree with Alison Johnstone when she talked of a jigsaw of measures being required to get there. So we're taking a balanced approach that perhaps we have to look at it from a cyclist perspective, with measures that might involve the introduction of a cycling proficiency examination, which cyclists of all ages must pass before taking to the roads. And as Christine Graham alluded to earlier, a requirement for cyclists to carry third-party liability insurance to cover for damage they are found to have been responsible for inflicting upon vehicles and pedestrians. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, there is a considered debate to be had on this issue. I think this afternoon has kicked that off. It's been a very good debate, and I look forward to its continuation.
Many thanks. Now call on Sarah Boyack, after which we'll move to the Minister for the closing speech.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Sometimes when you come in at the end of the debate, part of you feels everything that could possibly have been said has been said, but it also lets you reflect on what other people have said. And I first of all want to thank Alison Johnstone for bringing this debate to the Parliament. I think it has been a very good debate because it just illustrates, even amongst ourselves, the range of views that there are. But let's just reflect on why this debate is in front of us today. And I think it's in front of us because of the terrible toll of cycling injuries that Graham Pearson started off his speech by talking about, the number of cyclists that have been killed or injured on our roads. And I think that's where the motivation for the petition comes from, to look at a better way for looking at protecting cyclists on our roads and for looking at protecting pedestrians in our road environment. That is the motivation behind this, and I think that's where we should start this debate. And I think today has to be the start of that discussion rather than the end of that discussion. And I think the suggestion that Graham Pearson made, that the Minister brings together stakeholders and actually has discussions about this issue further, because we've tended to talk about investment in our roads and our pavements. We've talked about trying to get the numbers up. We've talked about specific types of routes, but we've not really talked about the wider culture and the wider legal environment in which we use our roads with respect to cycling. So from that perspective, I think today has been very useful. And I think it would be good if the Minister was able to look at some of the research from other countries, to look at the impact of the different types of legal environments that we could have in this country that would be different to what we have now, and look at the framework in other countries. Not in the sense of today telling us yes or no, but actually thinking about how we take this debate forward so that we can come back and have a look at this issue. Because it will be a contentious issue. I have already raised the issue in discussions with people, and people take an instant comment on yes or no to this one, and the people that reject it are very strident in rejecting it. So I think we need to actually just have a broader discussion before we get to the point of saying yes or no. And that's why I'm very grateful to the way that Alison structured her motion, because it enabled us actually to come and have this debate. And I do think it's something that I think the cross-party group in cycling has a particular role in taking forward. But I think the Minister could lead a debate on this issue and do it in a cross-party way, so that while we won't all agree in the last dot and comma, we can at least take the debate forward. For me, anecdotally, our streets do feel more confrontational. Now, we do know that statistically there are more people cycling. That is definitely a good thing. It's definitely and the trajectory that the Scottish Government is trying to deliver, that Jim Eadie talked about, in terms of more of us cycling in our daily business. But I think there are major challenges. While more and more people are cycling, the changes in our road infrastructure to actually facilitate that have simply not kept up. And that's why the package of measures that Alison Johnstone talks about in her motion are absolutely right, because we need to be looking at investment in our streets and our roads, but we also need to be looking at the culture. So it's got to be a package. Sandra White mentioned the issue of pavements. And I think it would be very useful if the Minister was able to commission some research on that, because anecdotally, again, I am absolutely convinced there are more and more people cycling on pavements, not doing so in a way that is safe. I have heard of people being injured as pedestrians. It's incredibly irritating when you're in pedestrian mode for somebody to cycle past you on a narrow pavement. But it speaks to the anxiety that has led to this petition coming in front of us tonight. It speaks to the anxiety of cyclists worried about their safety on the roads. And if you are a regular cyclist, I mean, Patrick's right, you can have good days. You can also have pretty unpleasant days when you get into work and you've had 2 or 3 near misses. So even when you're trying to be aware and you're trying to do the right thing in terms of the right way to cycle, it is not a guarantee of safety. So I think research, not just in the generality, but to try and tease out some of those issues that we have been debating tonight, I think would be useful. I've recently cycled trying to get to hospital and found that the route to the hospital was just not there for cyclists, and it was a very unfriendly environment. So I think we need to be thinking not just about generally improving cycle access, but we need to be looking at key institutions and asking, if you wanted people to use their bike to get there, either working or visiting that institution, how easy would it be? And I think we need to make sure that that test is passed. I want to briefly mention the Nice Way Code that Kezia mentioned it, because I think it is important about how we view cyclists and making sure the advice is right. The advice, for example, about not driving on the inside of vehicles cuts completely across a cycle layout or a street layout, which has you at a junction being on the left-hand side. So it ends up you've got to overtake a long vehicle coming into potentially over into oncoming traffic and then weave back. There's nothing that annoys bus or lorry drivers. In fairness
to others, I'd be grateful if you'd draw to a close, please.
So I will close, but let's look at the range of issues. And I think from the Minister's perspective, committing to do some research and doing more stakeholder involvement, I think would be really useful in taking tonight's debate forward. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Now call on Minister Keith Brown to close the debate on behalf of the Government. 7 minutes, please, Minister, or thereby.
Thank you very much, President Officer. It's been interesting to hear the diversity of views which exist even just within this chamber on this issue. And just to confirm, some people doubt it, I'm sure, but I do take the idea of road safety issues very seriously indeed. And I do agree that one death on Scotland's roads is one too many, and we do all that we can where there is evidence, an evidence base to suggest action to implement measures to reduce road casualty figures in line with our road safety framework and the targets to reduce casualties. I should, though, first set out the Scottish Government's position on liability in relation to road traffic accidents. A cycle action plan for Scotland in 2010 committed Transport Scotland to looking at incidents of KSIs, killed and serious injuries, and the implementation of liability laws in other countries to see if there is any evidence to suggest that this particular intervention reduces cycle accidents and fatalities. And as noted in the refreshed CAPS document published in June, we have not been able to establish a robust evidence base linking liability laws to cycling accident rates. The research, which has been circulated and is available via SPICE, looked at various countries across Europe and the cycle fatality rates between 1990 and 2010 and compared them against figures for the UK and for Scotland. However, it is true to say comparisons across countries are inevitably hindered, as has been suggested, by the differing circumstances in each of the countries. Each country has a different legal approach to liability, as well as differing laws on road speeds, different cycling cultures, different geographies and many other factors. And as a result, it can be the case that there are other questions which have to be addressed in terms of the evidence that has come forward and been looked at. For example, between 1990 and 2010, Germany, where strict liability is in place, and in Scotland, where it's not, both countries had similar reductions in terms of fatalities over that same time period. And compared to Italy, Scotland's fatality rate reduced more, despite Italy having strict liability legislation in place. Our reported road casualties for 2012 were published last Wednesday, and again, the headline figures overall were the lowest since records began. And that in itself obviously is better news than if they were higher, but we know we still have a long way to go. We know that one death is too many. That's the approach that we take to these things. And we also know there are ongoing concerns to address in respect of pedestrians, cyclists and motorcyclists. Pedestrians perhaps not mentioned as much as I expected in this debate. Collectively, I think we have to continue to ensure that everyone plays their part to make the roads safer. Now, I know that Cycle Law Scotland has been lobbying for a change in Scotland's civil laws regarding presumed liability for road traffic accidents. And indeed, they have met twice with Transport Scotland officials to discuss the issue. The Government has not been turning a deaf ear to the representations which have been made. The argument for stricter or presumed liability is it will raise, of course, awareness in drivers of vulnerable road users, thereby making drivers more careful. From a road safety point of view, there does not appear to be robust evidence to suggest that road accidents would be reduced if the law was changed in such a way. And I think, as has been said, I think first of all by Alison Johnstone, there is no magic bullet to improve cyclist safety rather than one intervention. I think it's obviously the case a package of measures must be implemented, as the motion states. We believe we are already delivering better infrastructure. We know we've got much more to do. The cycle training, again, which Alison Johnstone mentioned, and the road safety campaigns. Now, the Nice Way Code has attracted some criticism from cycling groups. I think it's very difficult to change a culture. It doesn't happen overnight. We can see it in other social marketing campaigns which have been taken over time. It does take time to do that, and I think it's a very good step forward. And it wasn't one that the government just dreamt up. It was done in conjunction with many of the cycling groups. And just on that point, I have a different information from Alison Johnstone. I understand that it's not the case that Sustrans support the change that she refers to. In fact, a number of other organisations as well, for example, Living Streets and Pass for All, are against the change which has been mentioned. And perhaps that's worth investigating a bit further. I think also, to come back to a point raised by John Lamont's point about spend per head and population, I notice he restricted his comments to the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson in London, but outside of London, spend per head in other parts of England is around £1.50 per head. In Scotland this year it's around £4, and next year it will be around £6. And that doesn't include, of course, contributions from local authorities. So I do think that we have recognised the fact there's much more to do here, and that's reflected in the increasing levels of investment which are being made. We are delivering better infrastructure. Interesting, I see Kezia Dugdale's gone. She mentioned Easter Road. One of the officials from Transport Scotland at the back of the room regularly cycles up and down Easter Road and feels it's a safe road to do that on, but it is very subjective in these things. It depends on your own experience and perhaps your own perception of the environment around you, but other people do feel that it's safe in circumstances. We are delivering better infrastructure. One of the main initiatives there is the Leith Walk initiative, not far from Easter Road. We've recently announced support for Edinburgh City Council's initiative there to have infrastructure put in to improve active travel. The cycling training, which I've mentioned, specifically cycle on the road training, which helps improve people's confidence, rather than has been the case in the past, sometimes training which is delivered in the playground, which is not a real environment for many parents. And as crucial as getting children to feel it's safe to cycle is getting the parents themselves to feel it's cycle as well. And to come back to the point, because I think it was Claudia Beamish that raised the point about around roads and so on, around schools and so on. That's where often you get very short journeys which are quite environmentally damaging. It is true to say, and I'm not passing the buck, 94% of the roads in this country are not controlled by the Scottish Government, they're controlled by local authorities. We have a responsibility there to help them improve that, and have been initiatives in the past, safer routes to school and so on as well. But local authorities and schools themselves can sometimes have a role, and I think a very good point made by Claudia Beamish was the extent of the roads. Roads being looked after in good condition, and also during the winter time, making sure that the perception that it may be unsafe because of ice or snow and so on. I think we can tackle that as well, and we are looking at that on a cross-portfolio basis. I've met a number of times now with Paul Wheelhouse, with Shona Robertson and with Alistair Allen on that very issue. So I think we are trying to address those 3 points which Alison Johnstone finished up by talking about, which was the road safety, better infrastructure, the cycle training and the road safety campaigns, and also encouraging local authorities to implement slower speeds. Not least, of course, here in Edinburgh. In other words, the 3 E's, that's engineering, education and enforcement. On engineering, steadily increasing investment in cycling infrastructure. You wouldn't think it, but it's a case that we're spending more on this than any previous government in Scotland has spent on that. I announced at the first ever cycling summit on the 24th of September, £20 million of match funding for local authority-led community link schemes over the next 2 years, including tackling junctions. On education, we've developed road user awareness campaigns to foster mutual respect, another point made by Alison Johnstone. And preliminary results from the evaluation of Cycling Scotland's Nice Way Code campaign suggest that it has been useful in shifting public perceptions in favour of giving cyclists more space and respect on the road, particularly at junctions, and an increase in cyclists saying they feel comfortable cycling on the roads. There's also an increase in driver awareness of pedestrians. I know there will be an opportunity to discuss this for the next cross-party group on cycling on the 3rd of December. Finally, on the Edinburgh's 20-mile-an-hour pilot projects, we've tried to be as helpful as we can in order to help them roll that out. That's been rolled out to all business and residential areas of the city. And also, as we mentioned, other countries, the Netherlands, where 20-mile-an-hour limit has been introduced, and cycling fatalities have reduced as a result of that as well. The Netherlands, which I visited to see what they do in relation to cycling, provides us hard evidence, and we should take notice of that. But just to conclude, Presiding Officer, I was very encouraged by the positive engagement shown by local authorities and other delivery bodies at the first National Cycling Summit, which we held last month. And I, for my part, will continue to seek constructive discussion about what more we can all do to make cycling a more attractive and safe travel option in our communities. And the plea of the motion was that we have this debate, and it's been echoed by other members, and I welcome that debate in protecting the most vulnerable road users. However, we do have to proceed on the basis of robust data. Now, if people think that the exercise that we've undertaken, which you said we do, we've done and we've published the results, if they think that is wrong, I'm more than willing to listen to other evidence, proper evidence, objective evidence, which suggests that there's another angle that can be taken, and I'm more than happy to look at that. And I'm supportive for that reason of nearly all the statements made in the motion, but I do not support it in its current form, given the lack of robust evidence, as I've said, that stricter liability could have positive benefits for vulnerable road users. But I do see this part, of course, as a continuing debate, and will continue to participate. Thank you.
Excellent. Many, many thanks. I thank all members for taking part, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.